Comparisons between games can be initiated with a lot of intentions. Some want a clear-cut result on which is superior over the other, and some want to know the differences or similarity. As for recommending a product to someone, people often present the most successful or well-known name out there as the center of comparison, because they are most likely to generate the most resonance for other people. This type of comparison can be called clarificatory comparison. Whenever someone is confused about an entity, we bring up a subject which they are fluent with, making it the central point of discussion in hope they understand the foreign entity by tying their existing knowledge to it. Unfortunately, clarificatory comparison might have been overused by people because of how effortlessly effective it is in terms of recommending something. I think it might do more harm than good if we take it too literal, especially when details are scrubbed away during the exchange of conversation. Such problem happens a lot when it comes to describing the subgenre known as the Souls-like. It's been more than a decade since Dark Souls, and I guess it is safe to assume there's a pattern of elements if aligned. The Souls series will likely become the center of comparison simply because its undeniable impact in the industry. However, while comparison has been conventional for people to seek out games they enjoy, I find the Souls-like matching to be much of a double-edged sword than being helpful in terms of meeting expectations. Expectation then affected me when I first started tackling Nioh, because all that I heard from outer sources before even knowing Nioh is a game was its similar playstyle with the Soul series. It is only when I realized that influence has gotten too deep inside me, and when I started detaching myself from looking at it through a clouded lens, I can see Nioh in a different light where it shines the brightest, however not without frustrations. It is undeniable that Nioh borrows a lot of ideas from Souls. The shrine, corpse run back, and showing dying spots of other players, all these are echoes from the Soulsborne titles. But below the surface, Nioh was constructed very differently from the beginning to end, resulting in an outcome that is far from its inspiration. In this review of Nioh, there will be some comparisons with the Soul series in several areas, but please bear in mind that these comparisons were not made to pit Nioh against the Souls. Comparisons are brought up to present how they function and approach in their respective formula themselves. This is strictly not a comparison video to decide on superiority. I have only completed Dark Souls 1 and 2, and I am most likely to bring the first game on the table because I feel more comfortable speaking about it than the sequel. The third installment is in my backlog, and I do not own a PS4 for Bloodborne. Demon's Souls is out of my reach as well. If you think I am not eligible to review the game because of this background for some reasons, I apologize first. But I suppose I am also in a position where I can access Nioh without too much influences from the other games, so I guess it evens out. Also, I would like to address that the perspective of this review lies within the very first playthrough of the game. Nioh is an action game on the front, accompanied by elements from gear looter games such as Diablo, and the post-end game is where it changes gear towards the looter side more, which has a drastic effect on how the game is played. More on that matter will be discussed later in the review. Also, there will be spoilers of any kind throughout the video, so consider yourself warned. If my accent is too hard on your ears, you may turn on closed caption. I have manually inserted my script, so you may glance at the words for reference to what I had said. Hopefully it will translate well. The story of Nioh takes place in a fictional rendition of Japan prior to the end of Sengoku period. Player assumes the role of William Adams, a pirate who is able to seek out a type of magical glowing stones known as Amrita by the help of his guardian spirit Shersha. But a few men have some plan to exploit William's power and have him arrested. One of the villains, Edward Kelly, captures Shersha while William attempts to break out from the cell. With a desire to save his guardian spirit, William follows Kelly's footsteps and arrives at Zipangu. His goal now intertwines with the warring state of Japan tainted by the power of Amrita behind the hands of Kelly. Soon after, William joined forces with Tokugawa Ieyasu in his campaign of uniting Japan, and his ability to hunt down yokais as a Western samurai has become part of the power that helps contribute to the upcoming peace of the land. Although the events of Nioh are based on real history, the choice of characters and timeline are nonetheless an enticing one. The Sengoku period was a well-known material for alternate history storytelling, earning a familiar spot in pop culture, while the hero of the choice, William Adams, is a lesser-known figure in contrary. To those who haven't heard of him, he was an Englishman and one of the first who set their foot into Japan through an ambitious expedition. He will then be known as the first Western samurai down the history. If you want to know more about him, Dark Pixel Gaming did a fantastic video telling the origin of this character. History is not my forte, so I will leave it to a much more interesting individual to deliver the info. I will put the video's link in the description. It is an odd but fairly effective choice to adapt William's story instead of other famed characters in that era. To those who do not realize William was actually a real history figure, it might came out a little nonsensical at first to have a foreigner meddle in old Japan, but the moment they realize the truth is also the moment they are in for a treat by discovering a piece of real history. Otherwise, if the players are really uninterested, the suspension of disbelief doesn't have to be deep, since the story itself plays around the idea of outer forces spinning the fortune behind the curtain of the well-known warfare. This outcome has worked on their favor thanks to the peculiar nature of the source material. Unfortunately, Nioh's fantasy implementation of the event plays itself straight, generic, and sometimes outright cheesy. A lot of the story, including the lore delivery in the game, are dependent on players' knowledge and familiarity with the events at that time period, specifically around the Sekigahara battle. The enjoyment I got out from Nioh's story mostly stemmed from my sudden interest on the period as I researched outside of the game, seeking out documentaries and the likes. But as for people who are already fluent with that part of history, you probably won't get much from Nioh's storytelling aside from some reenactment of details scattered across in the event. Backstory from side characters are intriguing, but the interest may not hold your attention for long. The fun thing about making a fictional rendition of history, of course, is the freedom to ignore historical accuracy and inject whatever twist desired. The main villain, Edward Caddy, was also a real person known as a wicked alchemist in the past, but unlike William, he never entered Japan like how Nioh implied in their story. He is included to drive a plot along with William, about two opposing forces facing each other, the usual fantasy of good versus bad. With that in mind, I would like to discuss a major difference that sets apart Nioh and Dark Souls. A difference in tone and the feelings conveyed through their stories. The settings of a high fantasy versus a dark fantasy. One thing to note is that Nioh was tagged Dark Fantasy on the Steam store page. And perhaps this is a taste problem, I disagree on that. The tone of the game and design choices are pointing towards being the high fantasy spectrum of things. To clarify my statement, I suppose I should roughly explain how I define dark fantasy personally. Here's a little backstory. The first ever dark fantasy material I have consumed was Berserk, a cult classic long-running manga by Kentaro Miura. Swiftly after that was Dark Souls 1. Completed the game and felt it was one of the most satisfying experiences that I got out from gaming for years. Fun thing about it is that I only found out FromSoft might have put in some references from Berserk right after I finished the game for the first time. A little connection that made me realize my love on the genre. For me, the most important thing that defines dark fantasy is the grim tone they evoke. Characters are in constant pressure with the situation they are put against. They have no odds in the world they live in. And despite the color dark, characters' motives and philosophies are not always black and white but in between. Nobody is having a good time. Dark Souls is the embodiment of dark fantasy down to every aspect. Lodran and every character you come across there all have tragic or even sickening backstories. The tone when they speak often lack enthusiasm, reminding the players that the land we are standing on doesn't contain much hope of any measure. Characters come and go, and players might even witness their death or hollowing in the middle of their own journey. Nobody was totally safe as time runs forward. When I say down to every aspect, that includes how the world functions. Take hollowing for example. There are a lot of different interpretations on the concept of undead and what leads to hollow. But my read is, when an undead loses all their sanity and the will to achieve anything, they step closer to hollowing after each death, as if they become empty inside like the word suggests. Although the player's character will not become a hollow technically, the idea of losing the motivation to complete the game fits in with the idea of hollowing. There are surely a subset of players who couldn't find themselves completing the game one way or another. With that, it has cleverly linked a depressing concept with the player in a sense, while also function as a justification of respawning in the game's world. Presentation and art direction pushed it even further. The theme of fire is about prolonging the unavoidable. Environments are gloomy and their color palettes fall in the denser category. The sky was almost never blue except in Firelink Shrine, because it is a safe haven in the game in which a blue tint effect was applied. Combat animations are, most of the time, not stylish but realistic. Music were deliberately secluded until boss fights, making the entire world feels unwelcoming. Music conveys emotions, and that is exactly what they are trying to avoid mixing too much emotions to disrupt the dread. And thanks to that, they have given the game a raw sense of grounded heaviness. I can go on and on with more examples, but I think you get the idea. Everything from the aesthetics, story, mechanics down to the subtleties all were considered to present an unpleasantness. Setting the story in a warring period of time is perhaps enough for Nioh to be called a dark fantasy game, but every other elements fall on the opposite side. I have been calling William a hero earlier on, and that was deliberate on my part. The role he plays in the story is pretty much a heroic figure despite being written as a warrior who pursues an interest of his own. He has helped Ieyasu to take down threatening enemies that have resulted the outcome of the war, overcomes overwhelming odds, and escaped death. The game's writing reflects his heroism as well. Side quests are mostly framed as a desperate call for help, and the people generously praise his ability as a swordsman frequently. It is hard to manifest any more stakes on the characters because historical events have already written their fate, so to speak. Nioh do bend some accuracy for the sake of fiction, but despite having the leisure to insert their own twists, the stakes were barely presented. Some characters were even protected by plot armor. Music choices have their own distinct motifs to convey a wider range of emotions too. Danger is conveyed by a more hectic score, while there is a more grandiose piece for victories. Gameplay-wise, it features much more stylish action to accompany its fast-paced combat. Victories are celebrated extravagantly, like how when a yokai is beaten, players can keep mashing attack to dismember their body parts, gushing out particle effects. Action camera angle initiates when players perform some specific attacks, and mechanics like the living weapon is a loud battle horn to go reckless for a while. To top everything off, what better ways to compare how they present the very beginning of both games, where they started off in a cell. In Dark Souls, a stranger saves the player by tossing a body with a key from the ceiling. In Nioh, William punches through a broken wall. These features might sound trivial to a lot of people, but as I said, it is all the little subtleties stacked together on the same direction that shapes the overall tone of the game. They are part of materializing the vision of the director and the team, giving the game a foundation for an identity. Viewing as such, the fact that you play as an undead like many others in the world of Dark Souls, while in Nioh you play as a character who has a much more important role within the main stage, is only one of many differences that speak volume in regards to which kind of fantasy they want to be. Speaking of stage, guess it is appropriate to jump directly into another element that separates between Nioh and Souls: stage-based level design and world design. This is one of the biggest factors that had made me rethink about the game and view it on a different perspective out of the Souls glasses. Nioh runs a stage-based level system where players jump in and out of a mission in order to complete objectives. which means the level design is constructed very differently compared to Souls in terms of scope, structure, and intentions. Technically speaking, the world of Dark Souls can also be categorized as level-based. Each area plays very differently and the bonfire system separates them into chunks. But the noble of it comes in when every areas are organically linked with each other, creating a believable, interconnected world. This is reasonably not achievable in Nioh because the story happens across several continents of Japan. It is just the nature of things that the stories of both titles allow different types of level constructions. While the finesse of connecting areas of that caliber is not applicable due to the format, level designs in Nioh are still above average but not without problems. A more jarring issue comes from the placement of the shrines. Shrines are essentially bonfires from the Souls game, a place where players respawn, prepare loadouts, leveling up, or even summoning a core partner. In Dark Souls, linking areas to one another is not the only factor that have made the level design resounding. The placements of the bonfires and how each area loops around them to make use of one single checkpoint is part of the brilliance in the design. Stories about people getting instant reliefs when they stumble back to a familiar bonfire while subsequently getting their minds blown were common. Nioh is able to pull off similar design but with lesser effect due to the overusage on the idea of looping the stage back to a shrine. Almost every levels, and I mean 80% of all the stages in Nioh, including the DLC's one, starts off with a shrine in front of you and a locked door right next to each other. The door is of course the quote-unquote shortcut later in the stage. I guess they have used the loop around trick for the sake of conveniency and missed the point here. The point of a loop around in Dark Souls serves many purposes. One is to open up a shortcut as a reward for exploring. 2 is to give a momentarily relief as healing resources may have been low after a long haul of exploring or facing a boss. And 3 to surprise the players and let the awe magnify the effects from the previous points. To create this surprise, shortcuts were put out of sight from a bonfire to avoid suspicion. Sometimes the shortcut is a hard to spot ladder on high ground. Sometimes it is an elevator that came out of nowhere, and sometimes it's on the other corner of a familiar place. Now, I'm not saying all loopbacks are well hidden in Dark Souls. There are still quite a lot of shortcuts planted right beside bonfires throughout the whole series, but they are definitely not as overused as in Nioh's case. The moment when players saw a locked door right beside the shrine, the expectation of coming back is instantly planted in their mind. The tension of pressing on in the level will be of lesser degree because they consciously know safety is ahead. Direction sense that detects ever slightly of looping back will only further ensure their expectations. In Dark Souls, this sort of expectation never appears to me that blatantly due to the inconsistency of the bonfire's placements. I was expected to see a brand new bonfire rather than anticipating coming back to an old one, and even if a different bonfire is ahead, it might be a hidden one that I may miss entirely. The degree of suspense is just far different than playing Nioh's level. Dark Souls advocate players to always move onwards. Looping back is only occasional and not guaranteed. In Nioh, it is the opposite. Players are always expected to return only in the matter of time. The difference of motifs here is the most crucial element that separates the level design of both games in my opinion. Giving them the benefit of the doubt, I think the level designers of Nioh are genuinely trying to impress by delivering complex layouts in their levels. And frankly, they have achieved so. But the loop around idea may just so happen to be held too dearly in their principles. It happens so many times to the point where I suspect this is a bad habit they couldn't shake off, dampening the point of having a shared checkpoint to just an obligatory design decision. Come to think of it, I realize how convenient it is to design a level with an anchor point in mind. Imagine building a level from scratch and the very first step is to put a shrine and proceed the craft around a circle. I got a feeling this is exactly what they did with most of the levels. Might I suggest they put in a few more straightforward levels with shrines only appearing further in the map to divert expectations. Smaller levels with only one shrine are pretty tightly structured, and I enjoyed them a great deal. With the shrine placement out of the way, let's talk about other features in the levels. Some levels theme around gimmicks that are exclusively within them, some are well executed than the others. For example, in the mission The Ocean Roars Again, where the location is modeled after a real temple called Itsukushima Temple in Osaka, the architectures and the concept of a floating temple above high tide sets up a unique atmosphere for a stage. In here, we are introduced a new yokai called Umibozu. They ambush players from the depth of water or the ceiling, and it is essentially the little gimmick this level presents, but the way they are camouflaged is where the brilliance lies. The creature has a shiny core surrounded by its body made out of water, and the color choices blends in particularly well with the lighting of the environment, making the little ambush gimmick has more legs for the level. After that, we have Spider Nest Castle, arguably one of my favorite levels in the game. As the title suggests, this stage pits you against spider enemies with their weak points located at their abdomen. The stage is rather huge but is well constructed concept-wise. On the top level, you have a broken castle beside a mountain top, and underneath is a cave contaminated by spiders. Though the level have a few dead ends, there's a side objective of collecting fragments of a famous teapot by killing some bigger spiders, so they justifies the explorations. Cherry on top of the cake is the Spider Queen boss in this area. Everything that leads up to Jurogumo preemptively prepares players against facing her, making this boss befitting as a final test of the stage. Spiderwebs across the level decreases movement speed, which is a hazard she can spawn during the fight. Her weak spot at the abdomen is identical to the lesser spiders as well. Fighting through the stage should be enough practice for players to familiarize the idea of reaching to her back. To prompt players even further to approach her back, armor plates are installed on her legs as protection. Bouncing off the armor from attacking should signal players to look out for other weak points. It's not like the glowing color isn't enough of a hint, but the fact that she is part of the overarching design of the stage lies the nobility. This level is a complete package that earns a seal of approval from me. Since I am not going through level by level, here's a quick round pointing out some better levels and the reasons behind them. The Iga Escape is a ninja house level where it plays around traps and ambushes. In it, there's a upside down trick room section which is not only visually compelling, but also backed up by some smart navigating routes. The Samurai from Sawayama is a huge level stacking 3 floors in total, but there are spaces connected together intricately which has genuinely impressed me. And lastly, a Defile Holy Mountain set in Mount Ibuki. Aside from the underuse of landmines, which was supposed to be the gimmick of the area, the misty mountain atmosphere is lovely here. The best atmospheric level if you may. Levels that fell flat even with a gimmick in play are as follow. Falling snow have crystals that gatekeeps the level into chunks. Players have to locate these icy butterflies and attack them, only then the crystals can be broken with a buff. Essentially, it is just find key A for crystal A, very basic stuff. Structure of the level is flat, without much vertical navigation either, but the boss here do redeem itself by being a better one among many, so I guess they even out. The Defiled Castle features similar crystal, but this time it is a vessel that controls the soldiers in the castle. This level allows a sort of semi-stealth approach, whereas if players sneak around and destroy the crystals first, the enemies will be freed and combat can be avoided. But the maze-like layout of the stage doesn't play well with the concept, rather it has made the stealth feels more generic in my opinion. There is also another gimmick in play during the first half of the level, which is the stench status effect. While covered in stench, the healing effect from elixirs is cut by half, and ingesting any food type items will cause a gross out animation, stunning William for 3 seconds. While the concept of feeling disgusted in a server fits quite well logically, the effect is not threatening enough to pose as a challenge. Bosses here are quite underwhelming as well. Honda is an optional boss where you have to break 3 mind control crystals around the arena in order to free him. The challenge is minimal due to the passive nature of the boss. As for Okatsu, I personally think she's not that challenging and has a bland, straightforward moveset out of the many bosses in the game. I will talk more about bosses later on in case you are wondering. The stage-based structure doesn't affect my general enjoyment of exploring, but there's one thing that irks me probably more than it would to other people. There's this artificial spotlight effect highlighting enemies and William, but other things they chose to apply the effect ultimately spoils the spirit of exploration a great deal. Enemies that are meant to ambush players, for example, are applied by this effect even in their non-aggressive state, defeating their purpose and placements for the stage. Sometimes even the environment is highlighted as well. In this area, there are treasures to be gained by falling down from a specific spot, but instead of letting players to observe the area themselves, the correct spots are artificially highlighted with white lights came out from nowhere. This shows the lack of faith on the players from the designers. Hints can definitely be done in a more organic way than just applying an artificial light, but of course it requires design. Personally, once I noticed it on the sentry enemies as early as the third main mission of the game, it can never be unseen by me. The effect heavily tarnishes the idea of self-navigating and the sense of achievement gaining from exploration, making the definition of the stage in stage-based level tilting towards being a theater. It is a stage play with spotlights. Levels cease to function as soon as the objective has been achieved. Yokai vanished and the human enemies surrender. A stage that functions around the hero William. I guess this is yet another difference between the two games with two different kinds of philosophy in design. The world design approach in Dark Souls does not function around the players. They are not the star of the show, hence the intimidation of exploring an unfamiliar world naturally snuck in and stayed in our minds. I want to reiterate that the level design in Nioh is not horrible, not in the slightest sense. In fact, they are way above serviceable. But it is hard to argue when you compare running around a complex field versus a fleshed-out world. After all, a stage was meant to be cleared, while a world wants you to explore it. That about sums up my opinions on the level design. Now let's get into the main dish of the game, the combat system. The combat is perhaps the primary reason why the Souls-like conversation started rolling, and that is pretty reasonable because when it comes to comparing a game, the gameplay is usually what people sought for. Similar third-person camera angle and the stamina bars all left an impression reminiscing to Souls. I am not here to argue whether this formula was originated from Souls or not, so let's get into the meat. Also for reference, combat commentary coming up next will not take status effects into account, as I will dedicate another section for that system. I will be talking about the core combat system in its raw form. Combat in Nioh is similar with Souls in terms of stamina managing and picking the right timing to take offense and defense. But Nioh takes the stamina system, adds a whole lot of emphasis on it and makes it the central mechanic of their combat. On defense, guarding in this game completely negates damage from a neutral attack, but at the expense of ki, the equivalent of stamina. So far so familiar until the break mechanic comes into play. Attacks in the game deal two kinds of damage. One is direct damage on HP, and the other is ki damage, which depletes the ki bar instead. When a party blocks an attack that depletes over the amount of ki available, a break state happens. The party within a break state is vulnerable from any attacks in an enhanced value. Break happens whenever a party got their ki depleted to negative value by an attack, so the offensive side can also be broken by an interruption attack when they overspend ki swinging their weapon. On attack, part of the ki spent on attacking can be replenished by doing a ki pulse. A white recharge gauge can be seen in your ki bar indicating how much ki you can recover based on the moment you press the button. The later you ki pulse, the more ki can be restored, but it also leaves you vulnerable. Hitting a target will pre-fill some white ki, ensuring players do not flail mindlessly and rewards landing a confirmed hit. This mechanic alone reinvigorates the combat system tremendous enough for Nioh to claim it as its own. The whole ki management system is so prominent that every other mechanics are built around it. Depth coming from the combat stems from this system alone. It is the reason why ki on enemy is visible by default, and throughout the game, players are likely to pay more attention on ki bars of each side than the health. Human enemies and the yokais share different kinds of ki respectively. Humans can be staggered by attacks depending on their poise when they retain ki, and their ki regenerates. Yokai's ki will not regenerate in normal circumstances after they consume it, but they can only be staggered in their break state. Essentially, facing humans is almost like a confrontation of the same rule set implied on the players, depleting ki and react upon their moves by observing their stances and all. Facing yokai on the other hand is different thanks to the addition of these yokai realms they summon. These auras stay on wherever they were planted for a period of time, and upon contact, players' ki regeneration rate will decrease. Yokai themselves get to recover their keys within it, but thankfully, players can dispel them by performing a perfect ki pulse called Purification while standing on them. This is an excellent addition as a threat. Not only it plays around with ki managing, combat with yokai becomes more than just initiating and constraining. Space awareness suddenly becomes a factor as the yokai realm creates a push and pull tension within the dueling area. On top of that, some yokais have weak spot on their body which upon attacking them will cause an instant break. Adding a hitbox that reacts differently on their model is commendable on itself already. One problem that has creeped into me while playing a 3D Z-targeting combat system game as such is that learning to approach new enemies tend to feel samey. Creatures either bipedal or four-footed tend to function similarly outside of their attacks. After I am done observing their movesets in a safe distance, I get in to deal damage according to what I have learned. And little by little, engaging combat feels like hitting a hostile sandbag that looks the same from every angle. To be fair, Z-targeting combat works the best when fights are played like this: observe, punish and reserve. Having weak spots that are breakable with melee attacks is a good inclusion because it advocates players to take aim with their weapons, which requires positioning on top of the timing waiting for an attack opportunity. Though it only makes offensive approach just that little more tactical, a little more is an addition nonetheless. It's a little effort put in to differentiate their combat from the Souls games. Combat in Nioh is more involved moment to moment. There are more options to consider in between every moves. For example, Ki Pulse encourages consecutive combos but relies on players' assessment to decide when to stop or commit. Players may choose between guarding an incoming attack to stay close with the target or dodge away and reposition depending on how much Ki they have left. Determine whether it is good timing to purify a yokai realm is also one of many considerations in battles. There is no doubt a lot more depth in play here, if we compare it with how Dark Souls handles their combat. With all that said, however, there are still shortcomings. The game doesn't seem to commit hard enough into these interesting mechanics that they should be proud of. Just now I mentioned facing human-type enemies are almost like fighting within a same rule set. I said almost because despite running within the same system, the AI's skill pool is handicapped. This is reasonable because it ties with the difficulty of the game. Allowing them to dispose all the skills is simply too overwhelming, especially in a one versus many situation. And of course, they shouldn't have counter moves that requires precision in timing like haste to prevent players blaming on input reading. But I am dumbfounded when I realize they have even restricted their AIs from using basic skills that deal heavy ki damage, such as kicks and pushes. Without those skills, the combat sort of loses its legs. The system of nabbing each other's ki just doesn't apply on the players later in the game. With enough toughness wearing heavier armors, holding the block button can negate any danger in a one-on-one face-off. Human enemies weren't able to deal enough ki damage no matter what they do. I think it is reasonable for them to use some high ki damage skill, or compensate by making the AI attuned to high stance more often when the players are blocking too much, as high stance attacks deplete more ki on the guarding individual. Any attempt to cut more ki out of the player should establish the intention of their combat system more prominently. The yokai realm faces the shying off problem as well. Perhaps due to the lack of enemy types, some yokais, including bosses, seems to exert lesser realms than they should. The realms will also disappear by itself if they have left untouched for a minute or so, making them less threatening. While the game is still challenging enough, both of these problems from the human and the yokai undermine some of the best mechanics the game has to offer. The depth stems from the whole key system is what differentiates Nioh from its inspiration, creating a combat experience unique for the game. I think they need to be a little bolder in terms of sending their points across. The restraints here are a bit of a shame. Next, we have the stances, which I recall is one of the biggest selling points of Nioh when it was announced for a release. During combat, players can switch between 3 stances, all with a set of quick and strong attack movesets of their own. In high stance, attacks are slower but stronger at the expense of dodging and blocking. Low stance favors mobility and fast attacks, but they hit softer, and mid stance is all-round balance. Oftentimes, I heard people describe the system holds a rock-paper-scissors relationship, but I disagree with that statement simply because they do not hard counter each other. Facing a high stance user while going low stance gives you an advantage on mobility, but that isn't the be-all and all factor that will decide the winner. There are no enemies in the game where you have to use a specific stance to defeat, though some stances works better against them. For example, the dwellers, when they get down to crawling mode, low stance attacks sweeps them effortlessly without the need to aim, but they can still be hit by attacks from the other stances with a bit of aiming. If you have found a liking towards one specific stance, you can definitely stick with it stubbornly and the entire game is still beatable. But the potential of the weapon will remain stagnant if you neglect the system entirely. There are still, however, incentives to switch stances, and the game encourages to do so. High stances vertical attacks, for example, excel in breaking Yoki's horns. Low stances fast attack rate allow players to inflict status ailments faster, and it gives you quick dodges to escape tighter situations. Switching between stances will not halt your movement or initiate any deliberate animation, so it doesn't penalize you to do so. Through enough practice, and switching can be the second nature. As for my first playthrough, my main weapon was the Odachi. Perhaps due to the playstyle of the weapon itself, I caught up with stance switching very early on in the game. Shuffling between 3 of them to create combos is a lot of fun, further adding more options at disposal. They are situational on the surface, but comprehensive if utilized well. The stance system definitely raises the skill ceiling of the game. With 7 melee weapon types available and a skill customization feature to tweak around players' preferences, there's a lot to learn and play around with. Weapons do not contain weight, so they won't affect agility. Onmyo and ninjutsu uses different resources respectively, so players have more flexibility on creating custom builds instead of building around a specific playstyle. Items for respec can be acquired very easily, and fashion is well catered to. The game is very friendly on the customization aspect of it. That said, while the enemies are designed to be vulnerable in front of each stances, the lack of enemy types is a letdown in a yokai-infested world. Some enemies are present throughout every stages of the game, from start to finish, and it poses quite a problem in terms of presenting challenges. In Dark Souls, a lot of enemies are uniquely tied in their respective areas, and their designs are thematically connected with the environment. This will ensure a segment of the world evokes a characteristic of its own compared to other places with different themes. Take Blight Town for example. From the top to bottom, the area contains a total of 7 unique enemies. On the top we have barbarians, ghouls, puppies, and blow dart snipers as the obstacles. Crake spiders and mosquitoes then appear at the bottom part of the town. Leeches scatter across the muddy swamp on the ground floor, and then barbarians that behave differently waiting near the entrance of the boss. Enemy appearance was clearly divided into segments to present different layers of challenges, and more importantly, the tension was preserved throughout the area by tossing new, unfamiliar threat against the players. In Nioh, enemies are often differentiated by elements and weapon types. The actual number of unique enemies are comparatively low, ranging somewhere around 40 of them, and that's including some reskins. The DLCs save itself in terms of quality enemies, but not by a big margin. As I have mentioned, the weapon versus weapon idea wasn't presented well enough to justify their differences. All human enemies are almost the same despite the weapons they hold. Yoki with swords and axes are pretty much identical with each other, and the Kusarigama variant has to be reserved at late game because he's the superior one among his kind thanks to the insane reach of his weapon. Though the settings of each stages are fairly diverse, repetitive enemy types dilute their characteristics. Players are expected to face the skeleton warriors and the dwellers in every stages, and they swiftly become a non-threat throughout the game after killing about 20 of them. Tension just wasn't there when you're expecting the same monsters around the corner. I am not saying Dark Souls doesn't reuse enemies at all, but the game has quite a variety to boot, so it offsets the matter. Enemies' reappearance also becomes a storytelling tool related to the lore of the world. If nothing else, it enhances the experience in a different way. Quantity on this part hurts Nioh's combat the most. Consider the game uses yokai of all things. The potential of designing enemies from those mythical creatures in terms of quantity should be off the roof. This is where I want to talk about the bosses in this game. Boss fight is where it breaks the repetitiveness of enemy encounters, and players are likely to anticipate what kind of boss they'll face next whenever they enter a new stage instead of enemies in the stage itself. And of course, they are mostly well designed and are good challenges. Firstly, I want to put a spotlight on the first 3 bosses due to how they are designed as warm-ups for the later bosses in the game. Onryoki, Hino-enma, and Nue each has their own little quirks to ensure players can adapt and grasp the basic combat system, laying a solid foundation on how to tackle bosses onwards. Onryoki's is a little subtle. There is a specific attack where it spins the ball of chains around himself after a slam attack. The timing is slightly awkward, as in after the slam, it looks like an opening for players to chime in some damage, and if they do so, the spin comes in to catch them off guard. This move is easily blockable but harder to dodge within range. However, it relies on the players to figure it out themselves. This is just my speculation, but I won't be surprised if this was deliberate from their part to teach the effectiveness of blocking. Hitting Onryoki's horn will also break its entire ki, telling players there's also weak spots on bosses. Hino-enma is a great boss for dodging practices. She has a few close range combos, 2 projectile attacks, a dive attack, and a grab attack. Her shock wave attack and normal melee attacks inflict paralysis, so it is preferably to dodge them instead of blocking. The wave attack forces players to do so anyway because it is unblockable. Later bosses have their own iterations of dives and waves, so as the first boss who utilizes them both, Hino-enma's versions are a little more lenient for practice purpose thanks to their properly telegraphed sound and animation. If players are diligent enough, they can even break her ki using projectiles when she's airborne, rewarding quick thinking. Players will then learn airborne enemies have low ki damage defense, which is a useful knowledge to have later on in the game. I dubbed Nue the Yokai Realm Ambassador because it is one of a few boss that pushes the emphasis on space awareness due to its ability to summon Yokai Realms consistently. Each strikes of the Thunderbolt attack is accompanied with a Yokai Realm. Not only it requires constant movement to avoid getting struck, but it also brings the realms onto your trails, eating up the space. Combined with its rather wide body model, movesets that swipes a wide angle, or the roll attack that summons lightning along the path, purification will be heavily practiced from this fight, and the push and pull nature of the mechanic should be pronounced. For that very reason, I personally think that Nue is one of the best yokai fight there is. It is cleverly designed around a cool mechanic they have, and they incorporated it well as a challenge here. Sadly, most bosses do not seem to take advantage of their realms better than Nue. The Ogress is another boss that uses the pulls to great effect, and that's about it. Which is a shame because the concept of yokai realm truly shines when they are heavily used. Once again, they held back with one of their best unique assets here. 3 bosses in the exact order subconsciously hone our abilities of the game through their design. For a game that features great bosses, this is commendable. Calling out Souls here for reference, the best bosses, or at least the most popular ones in that series, tends to be 1 vs 1 swords fights. In Dark Souls 1, we have Artorias, Sir Alon and Film Knight for Dark Souls 2, and Lady Maria from Bloodborne. Of course, there are lore significances and their backstories which enhance the meaning of those duels, contributing towards their popularity, but gameplay-wise, I have a strong feeling on one of my own theory in which the reason why these fights tend to stand out among any other encounters is heavily thanks to the Z targeting combat. The nature of this style of combat is the ideal format for swords dueling. Try to think fencing, where both fencers going back and forth trying to land a hit on each other, but without the much more restricted movement. It has a nice ebb and flow between defending and attacking that depends on reactions. In Nioh, you get a lot of these quality face-to-face bosses with melee weapons thanks to the setting of the game. Facing samurais and assassins are abundant here. All their movesets have the usual readable telegraphing and rhythms for players to get familiarized with, and they get close and personal with their attacks. The concept of honorable samurai duels just add another layer of awesomeness. However, there are still some gimmicky bosses scattered across, though I will not criticize them too harshly, firstly because they help with changing off from the usual scenery, and secondly, the quality of the other bosses simply overshadows them. I also want to take a moment to slightly talk about the boss arenas. It seems to me that some of these arenas are designed to give a little support for players who have found difficulties on handling the boss. There are objects put within to allow a bit of cheesing tactics. This rock in the field while facing the real Muneshige, for example, counters most of his moves that heavily rely on rushing in a straight line. The little shelters that can block Nue's lightning from above, fire that can also burn Magoichi, pillars and corners that blocks Masamune's projectiles, and this little stage while facing Sanada. All these can make the fight itself easier to a degree. I wouldn't call them exploits because they seem intentional. At first, I was torn about them allowing cheesing in boss fights, but a little helping hand seems innocent enough. Plus, when they want you to face a fight straight on, they explicitly want you to do so with an arena wide open without obstructions. Overall, the bosses are no doubt the best challenges the game has to offer. Except for the gimmick ones, there are no noticeable problems that are deemed unfair or frustrating in the rest of the more technical ones. The only disappointment is the lack of dedicated boss themes, which undersells their uniqueness, making them surprisingly less memorable. But there's definitely no shortage in the quality department. While the game has a very comprehensive combat system for people to dive in, there are unfortunately some other aspects that distract the focus from it. One of such is the obsession of progression the game seems to have throughout their systems. The Agyo and Ungyo system, for example, gives William permanent upgrades by doing some meaningless achievements. But the scale of the upgrade is so minuscule, in order for them to be significant, players have to clear a chore list of objectives in order to get enough points to do so. The upgrade rotates away after one has been picked so that you can't be specific with your choices. Due to that, they are not even effectively noticeable in the long run. The blacksmith feature also has its own upgrades via patronage points that grant discounts from their services. Pretty pointless as well. For whatever reason, they see the need to break apart something to pieces just to create more sense of progressions. And these two systems are the prime examples of it. Next is the healing system and the Kodamas. Each region has a total of 25 little spirits called Kodama scattered in several stages. The more Kodama you gather in a region, the more elixirs players get upon a respawn. Finding these little guys reward exploring, but there is a potential harm by tying the amount of elixirs given by these spirits. Players may carry up to 8 elixirs at max by default. Any extras go directly to the storehouse to become refills upon respawning. The number of base elixirs carried upon a respawn is 3, and every 5 Kodamas found gives you 1 extra on the base number. Kodamas mostly appear in main missions, which means the base capacity is always going to be lower when you first enter a new region. It can then be a problem if some players find the bosses in the earlier stages to be problematic. If they die repeatedly to the boss, there are lesser elixirs in disposal after each respawn until the storing elixirs get emptied. after that point, they'll only have the base number of elixirs upon respawn, which indirectly makes the end objective of the stage even harder for them. Bosses in a region aren't designed from easier to harder in compensation with elixirs count, because the difficulty of bosses in these games are usually subjective to players' habit or playstyle. Hence, people often found varied opinions on which boss is tougher or easier for them. Personally, I have not faced the need to farm elixirs at all in my playthrough, but I can't shake off the feeling that it may be potentially harmful to some players who will need more time to cope with a certain boss. Though farming elixirs is fairly easy with the help of the Kodama blessing, but inconvenient remains. It is preferable to let players get back into the boss fight without disruption in between. If they insist on tying the healing system with the Kodamas, I think boosting healing power instead of capacity should offset the problem. Next thing down the line is skill gating. Each weapon has their own specific skill trees, but about half of the skills are gated by either story progression or character's stats. Players have to reach a certain number in their stats in order to access dojo levels that unlock skills corresponding to the tier of the mission. I can see the reason why they are chopped off like this. Presumably is to have a better learning curve as to not overwhelm players with too many choices before they are comfortable with the basics. But by doing so limits the amount of skills available in early game, which can be frustrating to faster learners. Skills progressions can be made more organically by giving less skill points to avoid players getting ahead of themselves. In that case, flexibility remains and a more personalized build can be made. Putting hard stops on each segment seems a little rigid and redundant. Some skills are prerequisites for later skills anyway, so they sort of already have progression in a different sense. While we are browsing the skills, let's address the problems with the menus. The interface of the game, specifically menus, are, in our opinion, badly implemented in many ways. Even after finishing the game, I can't think of anything that is more tedious than browsing the menus, and consider how much time players will spend in the midst of them. It has made me wonder how did it get a pass and slip right into a game in which the focus is the combat. The problem with the skill menu is that it fails to make use of spaces to create a better browsing experience. I'm not sure if you can relate, but oftentimes when I'm choosing between skills to obtain, I got lost after I have scrolled up and down the screen. It is frustrating to redirect back to the skill I want to see. Reasons why that happened being the icons of the skills share the same graphics and they are not color coded. Plus, the sizes of these icons took up too much space, hence the need of scrolling up and down. A simple fix is to change the icon into much smaller sizes so that the entire tree can be browsed on the frame without the need of scrolling. Really basic stuff that will reduce frustration, not complicated to implement, and it looks tidier and cleaner. Look at all these spaces that have gone unused. On side note, I want to specifically point out some errors that can be easily fixed but ignorance seems to cover their minds, which is the false descriptions on Ki Pulse Heaven, Man, and Earth. 3 of them reads that after a perfect Ki Pulse, the next attack within a limit of time deals greater damage on foe, but this is totally false. Only Ki Pulse Heaven deals more damage in this case, and the other 2 stances offer 2 entirely different effects. Man being able to block one upcoming attack without consuming Ki, and Earth negates Ki consumption of the next dash or roll. This is a huge problem in my eyes because these effects directly enhance the effectiveness of each stances and playstyle. Heaven encourages players to quickly engage attack again for the damage bonus. Man allows players to stay up close to their target by blocking without expense, and Earth further enhances its evasive nature by spending even less Ki on dodging. Mind you, all these Ki Pulse buffs can trigger their effects no matter which stance players are currently in, allowing players to plan out which buffs to use on which stance if they are good at interchanging stances between Ki Pulses. To think that they didn't bother to change a few lines of words that affect one of their best mechanics leaves a sour taste in my mouth. Back to menu, I think the biggest culprit that makes the browsing experience such a sloth is the choice of menu they have decided to implement. Instead of having a more typical rows and columns slot by slot inventory, Nioh uses a vertical scrolling menu with multiple tabs differentiating the categories. The price of not using rows and columns inventory in a looter game of all things is a big one to pay. Imagine if you get a bunch of gears and you want to compare them side by side. This is not achievable here because firstly, vertical menu means items are stacked above and below one another. We are given another page that shows the currently equipped item, and the extent is just comparing two items at a time. And secondly, perhaps more crucially, items cannot be manually arranged here. There is a sorting function with quite a few options to compensate, but ultimately, it is still one hell of a sluggish interface due to the lack of manual functions. Comparing between two or more items become a painful procedure. With the abundance of loot dropping in the game topped with the randomly generated stats on gears, comparing them will be a common practice that is hard to avoid. Opening the menu is always preparation for frustration, breaking the flow of the game constantly. I can see there's a lot of effort put in to make it more accessible, but sadly none of them fixes the root problem. The game takes a devastating hit as a result in my opinion. A looter game is not a looter game if there are no gears with numbers and rarities. Nioh differentiates its gears into levels, rarities, and randomized passive bonuses. So far so traditional in a looter game's standard, but it doesn't take long for me to get tired of it to the point of dejection. It is not the idea of a looter game that disappoints me, but the inherent problems of the system implemented here in this game. Before we jump into the bigger picture, here are a few nitpicks. The inconsistent arrangement of stats displaying on the list, some bad word choices that poorly explain the effects even in the extended help feature, and the total defense multiplier value isn't shown in the equip menu. These effects are mostly passives, which mean they do not impact how the combat play out in obvious ways. Rather, they feel like numbers that you wish are taking full effect. Effects granted are also very specific in their field. For example, in the weapons, the ki damage effect cuts off enemies' ki when an attack lands on them, while the break effect depletes ki on a guarding enemy. Let them sink in your mind for a second. With so many unique stats jumbled into the pools, sometimes it is hard to not feel artificial about the bonuses they hold. The effects are measured in percentage down to the decimals, which seems to me is a haven for min-max players. I have beaten the game for twice now, and I am confident enough to say that these stats are not as important until the post-end game. It is only after beating Orochi, the second last boss in the main story, Nioh officially leans towards being a looter game more so than before. The game eagerly wants you to keep playing with gears. This is made clear by what the boss will drop, the first batch of divine equipments. The access to these powerful equipments through normal drops from mobs is unlocked at the same time. Divine is a higher rank of rarity and the only rarity that counts from that point onwards. They are a mile stronger than previous tiers, and even armor pieces have familiarity to boost their effects even further. Prior to that, the familiarity bar only features exclusively in weapons. As if that's not enough, divine items can be upgraded with pluses, like a more typical RPG style weapon enhancements. I do not think a single player focused game like such benefits much from all these spread out effects as well as, say, MMORPGs. MMOs are played by a massive group of people, and to differentiate everyone's power level, numbers are the way to go, and closing the gap between them by hunting rare equipments becomes a goal to strive for. Nioh definitely have more content waiting to be cracked further in post-game. There's a total of 4 new game pluses and a challenge tower called the Abyss that contains a total of 999 floors waiting to be breached. Wouldn't surprise anyone, but the post-endgame content lacks substance. With better and better gears waiting for players ahead, the developers have an excuse to create challenges that don't necessarily need to be balanced and fair anymore, pitting us against the same bosses with higher numbers implanted in them, or pair them up to create an illusion of new content. Hitting a brick wall isn't a problem because you may farm gears and come back later, fight numbers with numbers. Here I am fighting this duo before even completing the last DLC in my first playthrough, and I feel like I'm fighting a raid boss in an MMO. Gears the game drop at that point are strong enough to neglect damages they deal on me. And here I am again facing Sanada in the last DLC. The ninja Sasuke has a scripted appearance when Sanada's HP drops to a threshold, but I accidentally DPS through his health and the fight is done before the ninja had a chance to fight. Again, I'm using the appropriate level of gears the game drops at the moment, and the Odachi I used wasn't even my best one in my pocket. I think one of the reasons why these games are so enjoyable despite being difficult comes from the satisfaction of beating a well-balanced challenge. Time spent on retrying and practicing pays off immensely when players overcome a wall by their own capabilities. With so much numbers mixed into the system, they not only run a risk of messing up the balance, but also leaving opportunities for players to blame on the system instead of their own abilities. This problem is not exclusive on players who have found hardships in the game, but for the opposite spectrum of people as well. The idea of losing because of gears inefficiency lurking at the back of the head, or winning because they accidentally went ahead of the game with good equipment are both equally unsatisfying. Thankfully, except for item drop rates and the unlimited effects, the majority of other effects are not RNG reliant. No critical damage procs and the likes, which negates some of my complaints on the matter. As someone who has a little min-maxing tendency myself, I would much prefer they omit a majority of them from the pool and emphasize on those that has obvious functionality, like life drain and the elementals. That way, gears are less about numbers and they get their own uniqueness intact. Each effect will be more prominent instead of being hidden numbers that may or may not be effective at all. Sure, the system creates longevity for the game, but it became a number game at a certain point. Stats and equipment levels are capped until you unlock the harder difficulty. Break the capped point to confront higher numbers and obtain higher numbers, on and on. The longevity should come from the core of the game, things like the combat system and the varieties of weapon types that increase replayability. The game already have those built in and they are well done, so why cloud them with petty numbers? Let it be known I have no desire at all to play the game 4 times, though I can see the satisfaction on upgrading gears little by little, and some people will definitely find great joy by doing so. But the idea of always getting loot that matches with the same challenge they dispose is not much different from being repetitive to me. It is a thick layer of unnecessary fat that spatters on top of the actual substance of the game. With the biggest complaint I have out of the way and the review coming to an end, I want to have a miscellaneous section to talk about what's left untouched but worthy of analyzing. There are a few questionable decisions on the lock-on feature that I found counterintuitive. The toggling was set in a way so that if player wishes to switch the lock-on from a target to another, the input has to be direction specific. Push left on the analog stick to switch it from the enemy on the right to the left target, vice versa. If there's no enemy at the right side of the screen, and the stick was pushed to the right while locking on a target, the game will not assume players need to change target by cycling the cursor onto the enemy at the opposite direction. I see this as a limitation planted upon us. I have no idea why they will limit toggle in such a counterintuitive way. Being surrounded is fairly common in the later part of the game. Now imagine there are 3 or more enemies on screen and you're locking onto the most right target trying to toggle to the most left target. Instead of a single push at the opposite direction, you have to cycle through each and every one in the center one by one. Not only that, you can't toggle to an enemy who is located behind William as well, even though we can see them on screen. Toggling only functions 180 degree or less in front of William. On top of that, lock on will not direct onto the next closer target after we have defeated the current one. This at least I think should be an option since both auto-locking or without it have their own utilities, but as far as I know there's no such option to choose from. In a hectic situation, the toggle feature weighs upon players because of these limitations, adding in more inputs that can be ignored if they have tweaked them differently. To take a wild guess on why they have implemented it this way, I would say they are going for the sort of realism approach. If so, I would like an explanation on this situation. To add on to that, I can sense an enemy at my 4 o'clock if it isn't an ambush, so I should be able to toggle directly onto enemies I have aggroed behind me. In any case, a fast-paced action game shouldn't have a rigid lock-on system like such in my opinion. Elements related to cameras have always been tough in games, though in this case it is still serviceable. It has caused plenty of discomfort throughout my experience to warrant a mention from me. Consider it a nitpick if you want. There is a difficulty spike upon entering into the DLC straight after beating the final boss in the main game. This is due to the addition of several new enemy types, but it is still manageable. Facing new enemies is refreshing and all, but one of them stands out to be a nuisance real quick due to its moveset, the Namahage. Nioh uses quite a lot of delay follow-up attacks with their enemies to catch players off guard, especially with the yokais. The Sentry, Yokis, One-Eyed Oni, Tengu, and Onyudo all feature consecutive attacks that can be delayed between each strike, punishing those who thought it is safe to engage in between the sequence. While the delays have made enemies' attacks less predictable, too much of it might plant a habit on the players to play defensively. The safest way to deal damage will then become baiting one attack sequence out and wait for them to exhaust a full combo. Ignore any sequences that do not extend to the last strike, just in case. Namahage's attacks have the same design, but the delays are slightly longer than the rest of the group. The rhythms are almost like they are designed to catch those who are used to deal with the other delay attacks prior facing them. Their attack range is also ridiculously wide thanks to their long arms and weapon of choice. And they even have 2 different chase downs, both move in high speed, hits hard and covers a lot of ground. Compare it to the other 2 larger humanoid yokai, Namahage's chase downs have no downsides whatsoever. The Oni is stationed when he tosses a projectile towards players who have spaced themselves far away, sacrificing entire mobility to initiate a long-range attack. Onyudo's shoulder dash, while fast, has a backfire effect that will break their own ki if they bash a wall. It is odd that Namahage doesn't have any disadvantages aside from having the usual breakable horns. In terms of balance, he's a little off from the standard, giving them a slight edge over any other yokais in the game. Glory points earned from several different sources allow us to trade cosmetic items in the tea house. This includes character skins that will replace William's character model. But for whatever reason, the female skins cost 10 times more than most of the other ones. Some people suggest that the expensive skins were added when the DLC was released. Hence, the higher price count was to incentivize co-op play and prevent players who have been hoarding points from acquiring them immediately. Whatever the case, this is still a little obnoxious in my opinion. The stylish cutscenes that accompany with acquiring a new guardian spirit are very well executed. The writings and voice acting during these moments are phenomenal to say the least. They don't explicitly deliver the details through words, but that's when the visuals play its part. With interesting movements, transition techniques, and clever color choices, the minimalistic look and animation are put to good use as visual storytelling tools, delivering exposition with a different taste. Throughout my playthrough, I can't help but feel excited whenever I see one coming. Definitely more exciting than actually getting the guardian spirits themselves. These cutscenes alone prove that the game can still provide compelling, artistic vision without resorting to cinematic 3D rendered clips. An occasional breath of fresh air from the flashy, oversaturated particle effect aesthetic they have presented in the gameplay. Borrowing from inspirations doesn't mean that the formula will be stagnant. Nioh had definitely threw in several components into the pot to create a concussion of their own, and it has worked very well in my opinion. The key-centric combat system is the prime example and a strong proof that it is possible to improve upon what has been established. The mechanic earns the game its very own soul. There are still bugs and some miscellaneous problems that haunt the experience from time to time, but these are still pardonable. More importantly, questionable design decisions ultimately hurt the game, branching the focus away from where Nioh shines. In retrospect, I think my statement of them being lack in confidence in delivery remains. For every step taken forward, there's a step backward somewhere. It allows flexibility on making a customizable playstyle, but the skill tree limits the potential early in the game. Systems are laid upon systems to form an illusion of progression, instead of relying on players' improvements. Longevity of the game stems from the online multiplayer features and the repetitive post-content backed by the looting system, instead of letting the comprehensive combat system to speak for itself. Numbers took the lead in the end. For a game that had gone through multiple iterations during development, I wonder, is that the inescapable course of nature? The looter elements and how they handle longevity are red flags to me, though I suppose features like these won't be able to please everyone. Those who enjoy it can and may have already sunk a lot of time in it, and those who don't are already getting all the meat through their first playthrough. Comparisons with the Soul series is not going anywhere any sooner. But throughout my review, I hope you have at least saw any semblance of differences between the approaches Nioh took compared to the beloved Soul series, which had allowed excellent games like such to thrive. While the inspiration on the surface is clear, Nioh has taken directions they had wanted instead of blindly tracing the already established footsteps. For better or for worse is not the focal point, but the courage to craft their own is. I can't stress enough that Nioh has its own legs, and I urge anyone who have taken a liking to the Soul series to tackle the game without hoping it to provide a similar experience. Expect something different will likely give you more enjoyment and surprises. As for me, I left Dark Souls by remembering the world building, lore, and boss fights, while I left Nioh with the satisfying key combat system and the loot system which I couldn't bother pry deeper. Thank you so much for watching. If you had enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to support my channel. As for now, that's the best way to support me, and I would definitely hope to make more reviews like this. Or share the video around if you think there are discussions worth exploring from the point I have made. If you have anything to say regarding to my content, leave a comment down below. Criticisms of all kinds are welcome as well, whether it is about the production aspects or the scripts. Let me know about them and your thoughts on the game. You may also follow me on Twitter for updates. I mostly tweet about video games and anime related topics, so give me a follow if you want some occasional little thoughts. Nioh 2 was announced during E3 when this video was still in production. Though it'll probably be a while before the release, we'll see if they have made improvements on the matter I have discussed, or enhanced elements that are already stellar. Once again, thanks for watching and I hope to see you next time. In the meantime, I hope you would enjoy more great games.